Here's a brief look at Nixon's presidency, both domestic and foreign policy, and some of the challenges and successes that he had. In some ways, the election of 1968 was more about the division of the Democratic Party than it was of any sort of unified message of the Republicans. We know that LBJ could have run again, right? But he was disgraced. He lost credibility in 1968, especially, and over the lack of transparency in the war in Vietnam. We know that Robert Kennedy was going to run for election. He was campaigning, but he was killed. So we turn to the lackluster Hubert Humphrey as a Democratic Party. We also have a significant number of independent votes going to the South. So Nixon's able to split the Democratic Party, realize that these are some of the most populated areas in the country. He's able to split that party and gain the popular vote. He wanted a message that kind of suggested a greater level of accountability towards the government. He ran on law and order, which seemed to, in the campaign, seemed to be applying to the actual government and not the people. And it seemed promising that he was able to address some of the problems with the Vietnam War. He wants to leave. He advertises peace with honor. And obviously, the events of the Tet Offensive and the My Lai massacre were elements that largely discredited LBJ. So in the context of the election of 1968, many Americans were under the impression that he was willing to abandon this hopeless war in Vietnam. But rather than withdraw, he actually increased the number of troops and further, without really asking permission, decided to try and isolate the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a path from North Vietnam down to target Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City, by actually having the U.S. invade and bomb Cambodia, specifically the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and even parts of eastern Laos. In eastern Laos, Americans were there working with them to try and help them create more stability, not fall to communism, grow food that could sustain the entire area. And this was another seemingly overreach of power by the U.S. president. Now, over time, as people continue to resist, his policy lent more to the concept of Vietnamization of the war. Let's leave and let you fight your own battle. And that obviously carries its own consequences, as well as the entire power dynamic is set up to combat the Americans. So pulling out in that way is also further lack of support for the South Vietnamese people who are continuing to work with Americans. The invasion of Cambodia directly impacted the nation, and in May of 1970, we have a series of campus protests. These are things that are happening throughout the country, but there are two that are most noteworthy because we had the Federal National Guard murder students or kill students, depending on what your perspective is. So here are we often see these pictures. This is a really famous Pulitzer-winning photo. This woman's name is Mary Vecchio, and she's actually a 14-year-old runaway who joined the Kent State protest. And the photographer, who I believe was a senior and a journalism student, John Philo, actually, they met up in 2009 for the first time since he snapped this photo. Here are our four victims. And to understand what I will read in a second as Nixon's statement on the day of this death, it's important to recognize that there are several days of protests where students were not abiding by the ideals of nonviolence. They were not hurting people, but they were looting and rioting throughout the town. And that caused Nixon to make the decision to send in the National Guard. However, on the day of these children's deaths, President Nixon asserts, "This should remind us all once again that when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy. It is my hope that this tragic and unfortunate incident will strengthen the determination of all the nation's campuses, administrators, faculty, and students alike to stand firmly for the right which exists in this country of peaceful dissent, and just as strongly against the resort to violence as a means of such expression." Remember, as we've talked about the use of the media, you get these 4 cute kids, these 4 white kids with their faces on the TV. It's such a tragedy. College is an opportunity to create opportunities, to better oneself, to sort of begin to become an adult. And this is exactly counter to what anyone would have hoped for their children, either these individual children or their children as a whole. This is not the only place where this happens. Only 10 days later, at Jackson State University, Philip Gibbs and James Earl Green were also killed by the police in a protest, and 12 more were injured. And so the nation rallies, the people who are already protesting rally around this, and they're largely angry about the juxtaposition of the overreach of power in Vietnam, the callousness towards those people, and obviously the struggle to enforce it at home and to address some of the really valid concerns of the civilians who are protesting the government's decisions. Nixon doesn't have it much better in 1971 when our friend Daniel Ellsberg leaks the Pentagon Papers. Now, these largely implicate LBJ as someone who was manufacturing reasons to go to war, but it also implicates Nixon himself because he knew about this allegedly and didn't act appropriately to sort of act on further justification, and he worked to reinforce the United States' right to fight in Vietnam. So you'd think from these events that Nixon surely wouldn't get reelected. But just like any U.S. president, he's a complicated, complex character. Some of his recent victories are the fact that they're close to pulling out of Vietnam. And he actually, for the first time, he's the first president to establish diplomacy with China. And China is increasingly concerning to the world. It's increasingly strong. And this is seen as a huge victory for U.S. foreign policy. Much of Nixon's approach here is to appeal to what he would call the silent majority. And he would sign off on the protests saying those are just a few loud people who are making a lot of trouble, but most people agree with me. Some cool details about this election. Shirley Chisholm is the first African American to run for a major party nomination with the Democratic Party. Patsy Mink was an Asian American who ran for the Democratic Party's nomination. This is the first election which abided by the 26th Amendment of the Constitution to allow 18-year-olds rather than 21-year-olds to vote. As you can see here, Nixon wins in a landslide with 18 million more votes than George McGovern. And this is the election that's going to really discredit Nixon in so many ways, despite the fact that he actually passed a lot of legislation and made some progress on domestic legislation and foreign diplomacy. In June of 1972, the FBI catches some people within the Nixon re-election campaign breaking into Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. We know that Nixon wins a landslide later that year. And then the investigation unfolds. And we have the United States v. Nixon in 1974, in which U.S. Supreme Court decision rules 8-0 that he was integral to these sort of late stages of the Watergate scandal. And amid this trial, Nixon decides that he will resign. So this lends us to think about the impeachment process overall and where Nixon falls in with other presidents who have been impeached throughout history. First off, the president, the vice president, or other civil officers of high office can be, in fact, impeached. That could be on a local level, on a state level, or a federal level. They can be impeached for treason or lying, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. Those are vague terms, and it's basically stated that however people tend to interpret high crimes and misdemeanors at any given time can determine an impeachable offense. So we rely on the other two branches of government in the process of potentially removing an executive. Never has this actually come full circle and happened. First off, Congress stages a vote, and they have to get a majority of the votes in Congress to impeach or to formally accuse an official of one of these crimes. The next step is it moves to the Senate, and they conduct a trial of the accused. Following the trial, you have a vote within the Senate, and the Senate is, for all intents and purposes, the jury, right? And you need as much as a 2/3 vote to convict the president or the person who's being accused. If you get through all of these steps and you get the 2/3 of a vote, you can potentially remove the person from office. Many times there is more than one problem. There's more than one accusation, and so you could have 2/3 of a vote on any one of those criteria to be able to result in a conviction. Let's reach back to Andrew Johnson. He had been Lincoln's vice president, rose to the presidency after Lincoln was assassinated, and was constantly at odds with the radical Republicans who wanted to be really tough on the South. Johnson was a Southern sympathizer. Remember that the Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which Johnson vetoed, and then they overturned and passed into law. Then Johnson proceeded to violate that law by reappointing members of his cabinet. Then Congress moved to a vote. They voted on a majority and impeached Andrew Johnson. Johnson went through a trial and was not ultimately convicted. Okay? We see from this transcript that most people found Johnson guilty, and not most found him not guilty, but it was not 2/3 of the vote. Therefore, Johnson stayed in office. This is another important measure of checks and balances. There is an ability to remove somebody non-violently through legislation, according to the Constitution. However, it is difficult enough that it is not amenable to party politics pushing people around and wrongfully accusing those executives. Another president, the other president to actually be impeached, is President Clinton. We all remember that Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky scandal, apparently he had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, who was an intern in the White House. As wrong as that is for somebody to do that, and as bad as that is for a role model, that's not the problem. When asked about it, under oath, he lied, and that was the crime. So Congress formally accused him, and he indeed was impeached. Then he went to the Senate trial. And remember that during this time, there is a Democratic majority in the House and Senate. And so it's pretty close. There were 2 counts of accusation, either of which could have had him convicted, right? And one of them was 50-50, which lends to his lack of credibility, but it's not 2/3 of a vote. And one is much more across party lines, 45-55. Therefore, we didn't get 2/3 of the vote, and Clinton was impeached, yet remained the president. So we know he wasn't convicted and didn't lose his presidency, but he definitely had to answer for his decisions to a higher power, to his wife and to his daughter. So now back to Nixon. We still have that question. How could you re-elect him? Well, early on in his presidency, he worked to increase welfare, healthcare, civil rights, and standardize them on a federal level and not let each state figure out what they wanted to do. And this was a huge initiative in desegregation. In 1970, he passed the Clean Air Act. Who doesn't like clean air? He was responsible for the beginning of the Environmental Protection Agency as a government agency. He endorsed the Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974. That's Title IX, guys. That's half of us being able to compete and all of us being able to enjoy it. He endorsed the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, EEOC. That's something you're going to hear a million times once you get a job. You read that a million times once you get a job. Right? He's trying to put a ban on drilling in California. He's trying to protect the nation internally, and for a while, the economy's doing well. It doesn't last that long, but the problems that he inherited were not problems that he might as well own, and so there's some really good things here. Now, opponents of Nixon would say, yeah, those are some good things. However, it's akin to saying to Mrs. Lincoln, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? Right? The only thing that you can imagine that Mary Todd Lincoln could have thought about going to Force Theater is the death of her husband. And so the whole point is these are good things, but there are some people who cannot excuse all the other shortcomings. And that's why he becomes such a complex, interesting character to study. Nixon actually had a lot to brag about with his foreign policy as well. This top picture shows Nixon and LBJ. When LBJ realizes that he absolutely cannot run for re-election, they are conspiring, they're talking about what the country needs next. In Guam, this is actually the Filipino President DeMarcos, but in Guam, Nixon, in 1969, Nixon issues the Nixon Doctrine, or the Guam Doctrine. Yes, we will help our allies, but we're not going to undertake all the defense of free nations of the world, right? And that is where it goes into the Vietnamization. This is different from the Truman Doctrine, from other policies where U.S. presidents are actually actively trying to fight communism from within other countries. Remember that people's memory and patience is about 10 years long, and so this is a really welcome reform of foreign policy. Other really big steps that we might sort of underestimate right now, Nixon and Mao Zedong, right? There was such a huge growing tension. And Nixon is the first president to ever visit China during his presidency. And we can imagine that meeting people humanizes sides and makes them more likely to engage in diplomacy and less likely to fight. And we also finally have here Nixon speaking with Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev is Khrushchev's successor, and he is instrumental in helping thaw Cold War relations. Overall, Nixon is complex. He goes beyond that good versus bad dualism. Many of his shortcomings are representative of the shortcomings of American presidents and of American policy itself. And some of the improvements that he made also represent sort of that hopefulness and the optimism of America as well.